The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
On August 22nd, the White House released President Obama's plan to make college more affordable. You may have heard over the years about the escalating cost of a college education in the United States today. And in this report or plan that the White House put out, there were some alarming statistics. It mentioned that the average tuition cost at a four-year college has increased 250% over the last 30 years. 250%. Tuition costs in the United States have risen at about 3 times the rate of inflation. 3 times the rate. If you want to attend a university in the United States, then you should know it's the most expensive place in the world to go to college. And so the White House is working on a plan to make college more affordable. And a big part of that plan is to develop a college rating system. They want to try to find out which colleges are the best value for parents. And so they're going to rate colleges based upon their graduation rates, based upon the number of maybe lower income students that attend those universities. And as part of the plan, as you might expect, particularly from a more liberal organization or administration, there's money that's going to be dumped into these programs. $1 billion is going to be set aside to reward the states that have the schools that perform better, that are the best values. Now, if you look at the cost of higher education, just from the government's perspective, already the United States, Washington provides $150 billion per year for student loans. Students that are attending that need financial aid, and then you add to that the states in America that provide about $70 billion to the schools to help fund the schools. And then, of course, the new plan that's coming out to make things more affordable is going to be more government subsidies to the tunes of billions of dollars, really. When you start adding up, trying to get more lower income young people into universities, young people that can't afford it. And so who's going to pay those those tuition fees? Well, probably the government, probably the states, lending institutions, whatever it is. But pouring more money into higher education is clearly not going to make it more affordable for just the average Joe that's out there trying to go to college. In fact, as the figures have pointed out over the last 3 decades, it's having the exact opposite effect. The more money that the government provides educational institutions, the more those institutions are going to raise their rates, because they know the more they raise their rates, the more money they're going to get from the government. It's a vicious cycle. But is the skyrocketing cost of college today really the main crisis that's facing education? I thought this comment from the White House plan was especially interesting after commenting on just the escalating cost, which is almost eye-popping. But the plan says this: while a college education remains a worthwhile investment overall, the average borrower now graduates with over $26,000 in debt. You've finished school and you've got $26,000 accumulated in debt. But what's interesting is the first part of that statement. It says, while a college education remains a worthwhile investment overall. In other words, the debt is problematic, but overall, college education today is still very valuable. It's still worth it. You can still learn the things that you need to know. But is it really? Is it really worthwhile these days to go to an esteemed institution of higher learning? Mr. Armstrong, Herbert W. Armstrong, wrote back in 1971, I mean, this is, 40-some years ago. He said, "Modern education is almost wholly materialistic. It develops the machine, the theorem, the hypothesis that becomes the faith or the belief of modern science, but it fails to develop the man or to lead him to a knowledge of the true values." That was in 1971, and really, I mean, higher education today has drifted so far down this path toward materialism that, well, look at what the big plan to save education is all about. It's just strictly about money. That's it. I mean, how revealing is it when the White House puts out a plan to solve the educational crisis, and the only crisis addressed is money? I mean, that in itself reveals how materialistic modern education has become. Mr. Armstrong was talking about that in 1971, even in the 60s, before that, in many of his writings about education. And because of those writings, many of them you've studied right here at this college, you know and understand that the real problem with higher education today is not the escalating cost of tuition. The real problem is what's being taught or what's not being taught. The real problem is the education itself. It's not the cost that, well, still many families are willing to pay or to go into great debt to receive. Modern education, as Mr. Armstrong would often say, teaches man how to make a living, but not how to live. And so you see families and communities, great societies falling apart because of this, because people aren't being taught how to live. And as I say, Mr. Armstrong was talking about this back in the 1960s and the 1970s, and really, here we are in 2013. Today, I mean, there's quite a few people, quite a few commentators that are even questioning the ability of higher education to help young people earn a living. Even that is being called into question. Is it really worth it? Many are now asking to fork out all of this money to get, in the end, really not much of an education to speak of, even in terms of earning a living. Derek Bach, who wrote Our Underachieving Colleges, said that many students graduate from college today, quote, without being able to write well enough to satisfy their employers, reason clearly, or perform competently in analyzing complex, non-technical problems. And there have been other studies in recent years, one showing that 45% of college students show little or no increase in critical thinking skills over the course of 2 years of college, and that it's about 35% for students that go through 4 years. No real increase in critical thinking, the ability to think critically. There's one 2006 study by the American Institute for Research that found 50% of the students at 4-year colleges and 75% of those at 2-year colleges do not score at the proficient level of literacy. Literacy. I mean, these are some of the basics, the 3 R's, as they used to say. Just those things are not being taught the way that they should be. So what these statistics mean is that you could pay tens of thousands of dollars. You really could. You could go into great debt after 4 years without really anything to show for it. And keep in mind, as I say, we're just talking about making a living here, not how to live. I mean, if you're actually interested in learning how to live, then the very last place on earth that you should go is the modern university. Really, because they teach you nothing about how to live life the right way. They don't care how you live on campuses today. They say nothing about it. There's no guidance. There's no counseling. There's no instruction. There's certainly no authority. You're just left to roam freely on these campuses that are just increasingly becoming hotbeds for just immoral activity of every kind. Romans chapter 1, we read this the other day in principles class. The book of Romans. If you turn over there, I'll just quote from Alan Bloom's classic text on education, The Closing of the American Mind. He wrote his book back in 1987. I went through that as a college student. He says on page 340, the so-called knowledge explosion and increasing specialization have not filled up the college years, but emptied them. These great universities, which can split the atom, find cures for the most terrible diseases, conduct surveys of whole populations, and produce massive dictionaries of lost languages, cannot generate a modest program of general education for undergraduate students. He says this is a parable for our times. He wrote that, as I say, in 1987. Mr. Armstrong foresaw where this was leading in the 1960s, that if you focus purely on the machine and not on the man, you end up destroying the man. You end up destroying the families. You end up destroying communities. If only the machine is developed. What's missing in education today is the development of the man and the woman. Romans 1:18, I'm going to read this passage from the Revised Standard Version. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of men who by their wickedness suppress the truth." I mean, there's an active resistance against God in all of society today, but especially so on the campus. Especially on the campus. A movement to suppress, to hold down the truth as it's revealed in the Bible, to bury the truth about how to live, to teach young people that it doesn't matter, it's unimportant. All that matters is money. All that matters is an affordable education. Verse 19, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them." I mean, you can look at the physical creation and learn so much about God. It's plain, it's clear that there was a great architect behind the formation of the universe, the creation of the universe. As I covered in OTS yesterday, I mean, people get hung up on the 6,000 years of the existence of man, and they criticize theologians or religion in general, saying, well, those are people that believe the earth was made 6,000 years ago. And it wasn't. The universe was made much, much longer back in history, perhaps millions of years ago. But certainly the history of human civilization goes right back to the first chapter in Genesis. And there you are talking about 6,000 years or so. Verse 20 says, "Ever since the creation of the world, his," speaking of God, "his invisible nature, namely, his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse." You see, just by looking at creation, that's what Paul is saying here, you can clearly see God's hand. You can clearly see it. Of course, man is tampering with this creation and making it uglier by the day, but you can see God's hand if you open your eyes. It says here that they can be clearly seen, these characteristics and traits of God's character, clearly understood. Verse 21, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened." So God says the world became futile or empty in its thinking and its reasoning, and glorified its trifling accomplishments, really. Even that listing of things man's been able to do that Alan Bloom pointed out in 1987. I mean, what is that compared to God, the architect of the universe? How can you even compare the two? What man's been able to do. And man has produced some marvelous wonders scientifically. But look at what we're doing to society. Look at what's happening to future generations because of the way that we're living. What this passage reveals here is the knowledge about God and His laws is essential. It's absolutely essential, students, to proper educational training. It's not a true education unless you have this revelation included underneath as the foundation. Verse 22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Man's acquired all of this knowledge, enormous amounts of knowledge, on how to deal with matter, how to work with matter, and yet we can't work with our fellow man. We can't work with each other. There's hatred and strife and variance and hostility everywhere you look on earth, in homes, in communities, between nations, and so much foolishness just pouring forth out of the mouths of the instructors, the teachers of today, who reject God like fools. That's what the Bible calls them. In Psalm 14, verse 28, a little further down, it says, and since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a base mind and to improper conduct. See, there's no understanding, there's no wisdom. There's not even really any common sense. So little understanding, so little judgment, and all because we haven't acknowledged God. We've rejected God. We've rejected God's laws. Mr. Armstrong said in Mystery of the Ages, little or nothing is taught about God, but even in the elementary grades, the basic concept, the approach to knowledge is evolution. Is it any wonder then that the scholarly do not know who or what God is? They believe what they've been taught. It's no wonder they grow up to be evolutionists. It's no wonder so many in the scholarly community reject God's existence. This is what they've been taught from the very beginning. And Paul tells us in Romans 1 here that this is what happens when you forget God, when you don't retain God in your knowledge. We're left with minds that are void of judgment and understanding. Verse 29, here's what it turns into. Being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, it says, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, it says there, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, and unmerciful. Now that's what modern education has produced. That's the truth. And if some want to argue that, well, that's not being actively produced in educational institutions, then we would respond by saying, well, what are those institutions doing to prevent that then? What are they doing to teach people how to be honest and how to respect and honor parents and how to keep their word, how to keep their covenants with others, how to be righteous, how to avoid hatred and murder? We are what our educational system has made us. That's basically what Mr. Armstrong was trying to teach back in the 1960s. He said the future welfare and even the existence of civilization is dependent on the educational system. The future depends on education. And I mean, when you hear politicians talk about the importance of it, that's true. I mean, it is true. But then when you dig a little bit into the plans to supposedly solve the problems, you see right away that the concentration is entirely on the materialistic, on money and things. That's it. Certainly not on morality. Here the cost is going up, 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 and the campuses themselves are morally bankrupt. There's nothing there of substance, morally speaking. You look at the history that was unfolding as Mr. Armstrong was writing so strongly about education back in the 60s, and you had all the student revolts and sweeping across the nation, and that rebellious spirit was spearheaded on college campuses. One national leader at the time warned, this is back from the 60s, he said, "We live in an age of anarchy, both abroad and at home. Here in the United States, great universities are being systematically destroyed." And it was during this great revolt that almost overnight, these great campuses at these great institutions turned into something that was just grossly immoral and radically materialistic in every way, just as Mr. Armstrong said it was. But, how could he have even known that it would get that bad overnight? And so much hostility to all forms of authority. That was in the 1960s. Did the problem get solved just because we're maybe a little more sophisticated today? Just because the machines are a little bit more advanced? Did the problems from back then, did they really get solved? A lot of those rebellious students are now distinguished professors teaching young people your age that how to live doesn't matter at all. It's just about making money and perhaps going to college and not running up too much of a debt. Education has failed our society. It's failed because instead of disseminating knowledge that's capable of solving the problems of this world, education is contributing to those problems because the system from top to bottom is ruined. And for proof again, just look at the mounting problems facing our society. Well, God does have a solution, and as we know from Zechariah 4, he starts small, and that small beginning is right here on this campus. And we should all thank God that Herbert W. Armstrong College is different from the educational institutions that you see in the world today. Even the financing is so much of a blessing on this campus. I guess I'd have to ask Mr. Locher about the escalating cost for the average AC student. I think in the course of 13 years, we've raised the rates once. I don't think we're even keeping up with inflation. You come here with the $4,000 check, the entrance fee, and then from there you work off the remaining, whatever it is, $6,000 or $8,000 a year through the work-study program and graduate with zero debt 4 years later. That's just one of the financial benefits. But that is hardly the greatest benefit that you leave here with. Because Armstrong College offers so much more than just job training. There's a lot of that too, but there's so much more. Because here we teach you young people how to live. And at AC, because of that, life takes on new meaning. Here is where you learn about the meaning of human life. Here is where you learn about the true values in life. The AC policy is the same today as it was for the college Mr. Armstrong himself raised up back in 1947. As he wrote, it's based on the recognition that true education is not of the intellect alone, but of the whole personality, not alone of technology, sciences, and arts, but an understanding of the purpose of life, a knowledge of the spiritual laws which govern our lives, our God relationship, and human relationships. Not memorizing of knowledge alone, but a thorough training in self-discipline, self-expression, cultural and character development, not book learning only, but broadening travel and experience, not only hearing and learning, but doing, putting it into practice. And so the emphasis here, the focus here, is on character building. It's on developing a sound mind. It's on becoming emotionally mature, socially balanced, and morally disciplined. It's about building a well-rounded, service-oriented personality. True education, after all, is about learning how to live your life the right way in accordance with God's revealed laws and purposes.